Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Since the pandemic, we have discontinued our in-person events and now do these webinars instead. But that means that our revenue-generating programs have been suspended. And without those, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Thank you for your contributions. Today's program will focus on environmental justice. And we're happy to have with us Gerald Torres. Race and justice intersect in the environment. And that intersection will be explored today by Gerald Torres. He is a leading figure in critical race theory, environmental law, and federal Indian law. His 2002 book, The Miner's Canary, Enlisting Race, Resisting Power, Transforming Democracy, has been described as one of the most provocative and challenging books on race produced in years. He's currently professor of environmental justice at the Yale School of the Environment and professor of law at Yale Law School. It's a pleasure to present to you Gerald Torres. Let me give you the floor now.
Thank you, Cliff, and I want to thank everybody who's tuned in and other people who might be in the audience or might watch this later. What I want to do today is talk about environmental justice, and I'm going to proceed as follows. I'm going to first describe the history of environmental justice in the United States, from its origins to its legal expressions to its present influence on domestic environmental policy. I'll then want to link the movement, which really began in some ways as a distinct set of concerns in the United States. I want to link that to the way it's been manifested internationally, so that the environmental justice movement, while it may have begun as a domestic movement in the United States, is no longer confined to the United States, but in fact is a global movement. One might say, and in fact I have said, but others might disagree, but I actually don't think they would. They might contest it along the edges, but the thing that environmental justice has done is to center justice concerns in any environmental debate. I'm going to include, as I proceed with the discussion, some conversation about climate justice, because one of the ways in which the global environmental justice regime has emerged is through the global attempted global response to to climate change and to recognize that climate impacts are going to affect people differentially and in fact have affected people differentially. I'm going to also draw our attention to one additional point, and that is the ways in which the pandemic, which we're all experiencing, and in fact, which we're experiencing now by having to do this as a webinar as opposed to an in-person conversation, but how the pandemic has actually exposed the kinds of divides that environmental justice has identified and highlighted as not natural effects, in fact, created effects, and created effects by the way in which our policies have generated inequalities and have locked a lot of inequalities into place. Okay, so that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to try to do that all in about 20 minutes, and then we can have a conversation about it. So let me first give you some of the history of environmental justice. In my own experience, environmental justice dates back to 1978 in a meeting that was held in Detroit between a group that doesn't exist anymore, I don't think, but it's been reborn in the Blue-Green Alliance of the United States, and that was a group called Environmentalists for Full Employment. Environmentalists for Full Employment was a union-based environmental group, and there they had a meeting with the Sierra Club and the Urban League. And so early conversations with mainstream environmental groups took place largely to get mainstream environmental groups to pay more attention to the impact of the disparate enforcement priorities in the environmental movement, and to take seriously the impact on marginalized communities, racial and economically marginalized communities. That was followed up by the United Church of Christ study, which located the hazardous waste sites in the United States and identified the overwhelming location of these sites in Black communities and other communities of color. So 4 out of 5 hazardous waste sites were located in African American and financially depressed communities. One of the things that happened after the report and the study were issued was additional research, which indicated that of all of the variables in play, the one that was most heavily correlated to where hazardous waste sites would be located was race. So it seemed to be clear with that initial report that the racial inequality, which has been endemic in the United States and maybe globally, but certainly in the United States, also had an expression in environment and environmental policy. So out of that history, that early history, a broad scale environmental justice movement emerged. One thing that became clear is that the social activism, some of which grew out of the civil rights movement, some of which grew out of the environmental movement, but it was the linkage between those two social movements that produced what we think of as environmental justice today. The movement from those earliest days that I just detailed to about 1990, the movement generated a lot of activity, a lot of studies, a lot of reports, a lot of resistance. And one of the things that happened, I'm a lawyer, and one thing that lawyers do is we tend to think of problems as legal problems, and then tend to think of solutions as legal solutions. But one of the things that happened was with the election of Bill Clinton, the environmental justice movement lobbied to have some federal action on environmental justice. And what emerged out of that was Executive Order 12898 in the Clinton administration. I had the good fortune of helping to draft that executive order. And in it, we made, I think, some tentative and perhaps not fully successful efforts to do a couple of things. One, to identify what an environmental justice community is. That is, so the executive order, for those of you who don't know anything about executive orders, the executive orders are generally directed at agencies or those parts of the federal government where the president has direct control. And you could think of it in some ways as kind of a housekeeping, but you could also think of it as priority forcing. And so what the executive order attempted to do was to bring environmental justice concerns into the decision-making priority matrix that that agencies had. So I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to describe what the executive order did, and then I'm going to try to explain a little bit about the theory behind the executive order. So the executive order did a couple of things. One is it gave the agencies a definition of what an environmental justice community was. And this involved socioeconomic criteria as well as racial criteria. And it meant that when agencies took actions, regardless of whether they don't have to be environmental agencies, but any agency that makes an action with an impact on the environment had to take the impact on these communities into account, one. Two, it had to address questions of process failure. So it had to address questions of questions that spoke directly to why these groups weren't getting their interests heard at the highest levels, or even in decision-making processes as the agency fulfilled its statutory obligations. So they had to attend to process failures. The other thing they did was to focus on differentiated communities and to ask agencies to reconsider the standards that they use to make sure they were not having a differential impact on communities. And additionally, the executive order directed agencies to take into account cumulative impact, so that a person might be subjected to environmental burdens through air, through water, through particulate matter, through hazardous substances. The order required agencies to ask, how do your actions, the agency's actions, contribute to the various pollution loads that these communities have to endure? So basically that's the idea behind the executive order. It was directed to be enforced by requiring the agencies to produce strategic plans that would indicate how they would implement the order. So let me give you a little bit of background about why the order was crafted the way it was crafted. The order was crafted on this theory. The idea was that if the agencies had to take environmental justice concerns into their decision-making process, while it may not substantively determine the outcome of a particular decision, it would improve the quality of their decision-making around those issues that the EJ community thought were important. The model was in many ways derived from NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. Now, when that act was passed, many environmental lawyers, while they were happy to see it passed, were concerned that it didn't have any substantive law. There was no, it didn't make agencies choose the more environmentally sensible decision, but it did make them take account of the environmental impacts. One of the things that observers noted over time was that the environmental decision-making of agencies actually improved because of the implementation of the National Environmental Policy Act. So that the executive order took that model as the model for change. Rather than trying to specifically instruct each agency on what it must do, we directed the agencies to take these issues into account and anticipated that over time the agencies would improve their decision-making as regards environmental justice concerns. So that was the executive order. And what we have seen is continued movement. But I want to back up a little bit, because one of the things that I tried to do when we were working on the executive order was not just to listen to the experts, that is the people who were charged with environmental policy, but actually to reach out to the environmental justice groups that were out in the country. And so I invited a number of groups to come into the Department of Justice and talk to me about environmental justice as they understood it. Because one of the things that seemed to me to be, seemed clear to me from my work in the environmental justice area was that the community groups understood environmental justice differently than those of us who focused mainly on the statutes. So if you just take the statutes, right, you can say, take Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, the Hazardous Substances Control Act, take those acts, and they give you a particular definition of the problem and a particular approach to resolving the problem. One of the things that we knew is that the environmental justice communities, while they sometimes took the formal statutes into account, mainly we're talking about the conditions within which they lived out their lives, and asked whether those conditions couldn't be improved by the better action being done. So this meant that that any action that involved the physical environment had environmental justice implications. So even in Texas, for example, where I lived for 25 years, one of the things that that we did was to, when they were talking about creating toll roads, which I'm not necessarily opposed to, but the question was, can a toll road have environmental justice implications? And the answer is of course, especially if you look at what the impact of toll roads have on transportation patterns. So which communities are you going to drive traffic through as people try to avoid the tollways? And what you discovered is that the communities that would be most burdened by increased traffic turned out to be already environmentally burdened communities, environmental justice communities. So that's the formal approach. One of the things that's absolutely critical, though, is to continue to listen to the groups who are out there combating environmental injustice, because what you're gonna learn is that there are things like transportation routes, for instance, by buses, availability of mass transit, which you may not think of as an environmental justice issue, but in fact has direct and important consequences for the quality of life of these communities that are defined as environmental justice communities. Now, one of the first efforts to achieve environmental justice in the United States was to use what's known as Title VI, which is anti-discrimination in federal contracting. Using Title VI to challenge the way in which the government funds or spends money on projects. That strategy ultimately came to nothing. Well, not to nothing, because it didn't form the National Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. But basically, the courts held that there wasn't a private right of action. So private citizens couldn't use Title VI to challenge the federal contracting across or on environmental justice issues. That meant that the government would have to act. So that's actually one of the things that has happened. One of the things that is happening now is there's been a reanimation of government interest in using Title VI in the environmental justice context. Okay, where are we now? With the election of President Biden, one of the things that has emerged is a renewed commitment to centering environmental justice in environmental policy, so that there's a new executive order that's proposed that is designed to cure the deficiencies of the previous executive order, and also to give environmental justice groups greater access to the decision-making processes, so that the environmental impacts can be addressed before they require a remedy, that is, before the actual physical environment is changed. Of course, there's a lot of opposition to this. We can expect that, but in fact, that's the direction it's moving. It's also going to involve things like energy policy, housing policy, transportation policy, all of these things which have an effect on both the quality of life and kind of sustainability goals ultimately. So I want to step back from that and tell you a little bit about the way in which environmental justice and the environmental justice movement has actually transformed the way people think about environmental justice. So initially, the complaints were really about distributive justice. That is, the burdens of our industrial society, industrial economy were spread unevenly. And they were spread to be borne more heavily by often those people who benefited least from the economic activity. So distributive justice was the main thing. Secondly, I've already discussed it briefly, and that is procedural justice. So the idea was you have to address questions of process if you're going to address questions of justice. That is, the people who are affected have to be given an opportunity to engage and to influence decisions that are going to have a material impact on their lives. The third is reparative justice. Now, reparative justice is, as you might imagine, a claim that it's not enough to stop environmental injustice going forward, but in fact, there has to be a repair done to those communities that have already suffered damage by virtue of the environmental justice impacts up to this point. Finally, there's what's called recognition justice, and that is the efforts for groups to be recognized for who they are. Now, that often has most residents, for me anyway, when I think about tribal communities, because tribal communities have suffered environmental injustice in ways that are similar to the things that I've just been describing, but also in different ways. Because to the extent that you consider tribal nations sovereign, they have the obligation not just to help manage resources, but also to keep their people safe where possible. So that if tribal interests are not taken into account, then environmental justice is going to be incomplete. Let me give you one other example in this way. So because the standards for food safety, for example, are predicated on the standard American diet. But of course, there's subpopulations within the American community that have different diets. So some, what qualifies as safe fish that are safe to consume meet that standard on the basis of the average amount of fish that Americans consume. Well, some subpopulations consume far more fish in their diet, and thus the standard, which would be safe for the average American, is in fact not safe for them. So that's an example of the way in which impact on these communities have to be taken into account. Now, I want to turn here to climate for just about 5 minutes, then I'll open the floor to discussion. What climate has revealed, what climate change has revealed, is that there are communities that are going to be directly affected before others are affected, and there are going to be some communities that have what we'll call community-based claims. So indigenous communities, native communities, especially coastal communities, we've already seen this in Alaska, are affected both in terms of their capacity to make a living, but also in terms of land loss to sea level change. One of the issues that has arisen is whether these communities have a right to be conceived of, or whether the harm ought to be conceived of as a harm to the entire community, and thus whether the entire community has to be compensated for the burdens that they're suffering. I think we're going to see that there's already movement in that direction, and we'll see it not just for indigenous communities, but other communities that have integrity that will be challenged or sacrificed at the altar of climate change. Last point, even though I've been talking about this primarily as a domestic American issue, it has at this point spread globally, so that there in Mexico, you have issues of environmental justice that are being raised by indigenous communities and by communities that are burdened because of the past environmental policies. You see it throughout Latin America. What you are also seeing it arise as is resistance to the dumping of our trash. So our industrial economies produce a lot of waste. One of the things that we've been doing is outsourcing the waste. As a friend of mine once remarked, whenever you throw something away, you have to remember that there is no away, right? You're putting it somewhere, and it's going to go somewhere. And what some communities around the world have started to resist is our use of them as sites for our waste. So waste streams is another way to think about how environmental justice issues arise in the context of global trade and global commerce. There are obviously many other ways, and I'd be happy to talk about those, but let's just leave it there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or just have a conversation or talk about whatever people want to talk about. Thank you.
Okay, Gerald. Well, thank you for that. We will now open the floor for questions and discussion. Let me just say a word about how we will handle this. Since there are some people watching on YouTube, we will ask those on YouTube who have a question to email the question or comment to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I will pass your question on to Gerald here in the Zoom room. Those who are in the Zoom room, of course, you can raise your questions directly. And to do that, just wave at me and I will call on you and give you an opportunity to speak. So to begin, is there anyone ready with a question?
I should have said something more provocative.
No, it just takes time to digest all that has been said. Let me just start it off then with a comment or question, actually. You mentioned the correlation between race and poverty and correlation of those with those sites that are most polluted, where toxic waste is dumped, etc. And of course, seems pretty obvious to me that the reason there is such a correlation is because it is poor communities and minority communities that lack political power, are less able to prevent their areas from becoming dumps. And so I'd just like to, and of course, I guess what the executive order that you discussed did was to give a little weight from the federal government to those communities to make it possible for them to resist or to seek redress. So could you talk a little bit about the whole element of political power as necessary to achieve environmental justice?
Yeah, let me. I mean, that's a great question. Obviously, opens a lot of ancillary questions as well. But let me just tell you, one thing we've discovered from the research. I don't know where everyone is joining us from, but if you live in the United States at all, or have lived in the United States, or just read about the United States, one thing you discover, right, is that despite the efforts to achieve racial justice, there are, in fact, what some sociologists have called kind of stock stories about race and scripts about race. And so one of the things the research has shown is that the communities that are often most at risk are those communities that are in transition. So in transition from brown to black, or poor white to brown, or poor black to brown. And the reason that they are most in jeopardy is the application of what I've called the kind of racial scripts have reduced the efficacy of concerted political action. It's made concerted political action more difficult, largely because there's been less solidarity. So that those communities that are unable to resist as a community will continue to be basically at the mercy of these kinds of decisions. But I want to also reflect a couple of things. Some of the stuff that I've been talking about has been baked in. So, you know, most of you are familiar with redlining and the way in which segregated communities were essentially created in the United States. Well, what recent research also indicates is that you can take a satellite photograph of American cities, and just by virtue of the tree canopy cover, be able to predict who lives there. As heat becomes a major issue in climate change, the lack of green, especially tree canopy cover in urban areas, has a differential impact on the way in which heat is able to be controlled. So I want to emphasize that heat is a major cause of excess deaths in the city. In the last hurricane in New Orleans, more people died of heat because of lack of power than from the storm, its direct impact of the storm itself. But in any case, let me go back to my main point, which is about green cover. Because African-American and poor communities tend to have less green cover, their capacity to deal with heat is reduced. But then the evidence also shows that where there's green cover, particulate matter is filtered out of the air at a higher rate. So the greener the neighborhoods, the less particulate matter in the atmosphere, the better the quality of the air, the fewer precursors for things like asthma. So those exist. The last thing, which we had not anticipated finding, was the impact on mental health. That access to green spaces, access to parks, access to just greenery in your environment actually reduces stress. And so the physical impacts of added stress are real. They're not made up. And the impact on your mental health is real too. So it's the lack of capacity to mobilize politically, or reduce capacity to mobilize politically, right? And then having to confront baked in inequalities as precursors to the way in which environmental justice concerns have evolved. Okay, having said that, I also want to be clear that environmental justice activism is now well established, so that you have a number of groups, both locally, regionally, state, and internationally, that are able to mobilize political opposition. So the fact that the Biden administration, as part of the infrastructure plan that was announced, includes things that will have a direct impact on the environmental quality of lives of people who are part of environmental justice communities is not an accident. It includes these things because of the activism over the last generation. Similarly, when people talk about energy transformation, which is of course on the top of everyone's mind in regards to addressing climate. One of the things one of the bywords that you now hear coming out of politicians' mouth, but in fact started with community activists, is the idea of a just transition. That is, you can't transition from fossil fuels to non-fossil fuels for energy without taking into account the impact of that transition on poor and marginalized and racialized communities. So I think there's a tremendous struggle actually, but that the environmental justice community is now at least a generation old and has figured out how to influence federal policy. But of course, like everything else, it gets caught up in the politics of the moment, and whether we can actually pull it through is a big question. One of the things environmentalists have got to do is to be a powerful enough political force so that politicians feel like they have to listen. And I think the EJ has been one way to do that.
Okay. Your mention of the importance of greenery for mental health reminds me of the fact that during the pandemic, when we have been locked down to our houses, kept indoors, etc., how important it has been to be able to get outside and be a bit amongst nature. That is certainly, I can testify myself. That's helped to me to endure this long period of lockdown.
Yeah, no, there's no question. I mean, I grew up in Southern California, and my environmentalism, I feel like I've been an environmentalist my entire life, really was rooted in my ability to, what I often joke was my wasted youth at the beach, but also hiking up the draws and, into the foothills. I mean, those there's a kind of persuasion that nature can provide just by being out in it. And then you start to appreciate it not as an amenity, but as part of what is essential to the world. And I think that linkage is important. I mean, I think the transition in contemporary environmental policy that the environmental justice movement has produced is the concern with justice as you start to design and articulate policy. And we're seeing this in food. We're seeing it in the food justice, as it's called now, right? We're seeing it as a way to think about one of the essential elements of any public policy that you're going to create.
Okay. Do we have any questions or comments from anyone here in the Zoom room? Just wave at me. I see. Oh, okay. Kurt Firestone.
Hi. First of all, let me tell you, I'm a dual resident. I live right now in San Miguel de Allende, but I also am fortunate enough to have a home in British Columbia. And in British Columbia, we are experiencing climate disaster today and have been through fires and drought over the last year, now covered with floods.
And I understand, I don't mean to interrupt, but I understand that Vancouver was literally cut off from the rest of Canada by the recent floods.
That's correct, and there are problems with the city of Victoria, the provincial capital, being cut off from the rest of Vancouver Island, and I don't reside in either of those locations, but I reside on a small island where three of our major connecting roads also were washed out during this disaster that is not just current, but is ongoing later this week. That's just the lead in, though, to some perspective, and also of me, that environmental justice was, when I lived in Seattle, Washington previously, was certainly part of our left wing, I'll call it, nomenclature and experience. What I want to bring up is what I see as a political civil war in the United States between and I'll use my words, the fascist Republican Party and the rest of the country. And I would like to hear any comments you might have on how the right-wing Republicans and others who are ignoring the environmental disaster that is going on in the world today can be turned around. I'm serious. I think the Democrats at various times are doing something that is good, and you mentioned the history under the Clinton administration, and I gather some things positive are going underneath the Biden administration. On the other hand, the Republicans controlling the Senate the way they do, and controlling, I think, a lot of the agenda of the United States these days. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how we convince, I should say, or turn around the people who are preventing environmental justice from taking place. Environmental justice not only for the that hits our minority, I don't like the word minority, but our communities of color who and low-income communities, but also do affect the wealthiest of us in our economic scale.
I'm glad it's a simple question.
Oh, that's all right. But I think it's one that, I think it's one that we need to talk about as we move forward. And I know Cliff talks about capitalism and socialism and so forth, but we live in a North American capitalist society, and yet we have to change things around.
No, I mean, what I would focus on now, in fact, am focusing on now with the people I work with, right? While I do most of my research is in environmental justice, the groups I work with are mainly concerned with democratic reform, because what is at stake currently in the United States is the maintenance of a democratic republic, and the resistance to locking in anti-democratic policies, and that's where the struggle is now. I mean, the fact that the Congress has not passed the essentially the protective vote bills, the fact that we still permit rank partisan gerrymandering that seals in essentially minority governments, is a fundamental, fundamental problem that has to be part of whatever work we do. One of the issues, of course, is that the Constitution itself incorporates anti-democratic principles. People don't like to consider it, but if you look at, you said that the Senate is controlled by Republicans, and that's true only because the Senate is one of those non-democratic aspects of our national governance that the Constitution seals in. The Democratic senators represent over 20 million more people than Republican senators, although they split 50-50. So what it means is that the voters who vote for those Republican senators, in fact, their vote has a higher value than the voters who live in Democratic states. The slogan that I've been using is one vote, one value. And rather than one person, one vote. Every person's vote should count the same. And that means taking into account those institutional impediments to the full articulation of democratic polity. So that I was talking to a group called Green Latinos about a year ago. And a couple of things are true, right? One is that Latinos tend to be more loyal Green voters than any other constituency in the environmental movement. Why that's true, I have no explanation, but it seems to be true if you look at the data. So what I said to the group was that if you're not doing voter registration, you're not doing environmental work. You've got to mobilize those people, not just get them registered, but you've got to get them voting. So, Texas, which I love and lived there for 25 years, it doesn't have if the people who were eligible to vote voted, you wouldn't see the division of power the way it is in Texas currently. And what states like Texas are trying to do is to lock in electoral gains for the people who are in power now. And that is, in my view, fundamentally anti-democratic and has to be challenged. And we can't be afraid of saying it has to be challenged. It has to be totally apart from what the substantive policies might be. The legitimacy of a democratic republic requires that it be democratic. And so the questions of legitimacy, which are on the table right now, for better or for worse, require us to pay attention to the processes of democratic representation. There's no two ways about it.
Thank you.
It's been suggested that we might take this opportunity to ask you to comment a little bit about critical race theory and all of the controversy around that, whatever it means to the people who are contesting it.
I'd be happy to, but I saw Norma had her hand up. I wonder if
That's okay. That was one of my questions. My other essential comment is you could fill the whole government from east to west with Democrats, and you would get the same broken behavior, horrible behavior about, I think you might agree with me. You cannot divide it into Democrat and Republican. It doesn't work that way. The people that own the representatives are in charge, and you could call it corporate or whatever, but the interest by our representative, people don't know shit. They're so disinformed that if they all were given the right to vote and they all went to the polls, you'd still end up with an oppressive structure because people think, well, we have to take care of this and I don't want to take everything. You know, AOC is marginalized. AOC and the squad are marginalized because their ideas appear extreme to most people, I think. The way they're represented, the media, of course, helped out. Anyway, I wasn't talking about CRT as a little bit. I think we should talk about it. Why is it? You know, you said, well, Cliff said it right too. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about critical race theory. I mean, one of the yeah, I was practically in the room when it was created, so it's like I feel like I have some basis for talking about it. You know, it's funny, you know, because you can write in this area for 20 years and no one pays any attention, but when people decide to make it a political issue, then people pay attention. Although I want to do two things. One, I want to address the caricature of it. And then I want to talk about what critical race theory is, right? If you look at the people who are attempting to use critical race theory as a slogan to demonize efforts at equality, then what you realize is they have no interest at all in actually trying to explain what critical race theory is or has done. What they want to do is to create a boogeyman that they can fill with whatever caricature they want. So it also conflates things like, you know, DEI training into critical race theory. And you know, purports to try to weed out people who are indoctrinating their children in grade school. You know, I can tell you to a point certain that critical race theory is not being taught in any grade school in America.
What's DEI?
DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, and there's a lot of it's a you know, it's a minor industry now in the United States, right? And you know, there are good parts and bad parts of it, but it's not part of CRT, right? Because all CRT does, I mean, in some ways, its claims can be reduced to a few simple points. One is that race has always been a factor in the political evolution of the United States. That it has been institutionalized in ways that are completely that produce predictable, racially identifiable results. So that let's go back to the example I gave about redlining. Redlining restricted where African Americans could secure mortgages to buy property. If you look at the way in which African Americans were systematically restricted from acquiring real estate, but what you discover is that the real estate they could get was typically in those areas that produce less wealth over time. And the inability to finance purchases meant that the African American community has a far lesser wealth base than the overall white community. which is not to say that wealth is evenly distributed among white people either, right? One of the things that CRT also says is that the use of racial categories is often done to obscure other kinds of inequality that are extant in society. And so you have to ask, what work is race doing in this instance or that instance? And when you uncover that, then you're able to ask, why is race being put to this ideological end as opposed to that ideological end? So it's really asking, how has race been ramified in our institutional life, in our social life, in the way we understand the world, right? Earlier, right, I described racial scripts, right? And racial scripts are those things that kind of explain how race ought to work, right? So in our book, Lonnie and I talk about what we talk about racial scripts, but we also talk about race as a kind of distance from blackness. So it's rather than white and black. Whiteness is defined in shades, basically, as you differentiate yourself from the black community, right? And it's a way in which the other communities of color, right, are defined, and it's also a way in which politics and political power is distributed. So, critical race theory just asks some very simple questions, and you get varieties of answers. I will say it also started in law schools, because it said, how can understanding the impact of race help explain how one or another of particular decisions are reached?
The thing that I was kind of getting at was how it's being talked about as, oh, we can't have that critical race theory here. And I've heard it said that it's not here any place or most places. It's just not there.
Yeah, no, it's exactly. I mean, it's like I said, it was adopted by the critics who popularized the complaint about it as a kind of ragbag, just stuff whatever they don't like about I don't know, about racial politics into it, and label it CRT as opposed to looking at what CRT, the work that's actually been done in the area, and asking. So, like, let's take, for example, the expression I used to Kurt earlier, right? One value, one vote, one value, right? Well, that emerged from CRT discussion. The idea that votes should count the same, right? And that, but it's taken to be anti-democratic because it says, okay, let's look at districting. Well, there's no constitutional obligation that we select our representatives through geographic districts, right? Not at all. But by focusing on geographic districts, and there's some justification for districts, but what they permitted, of course, is a system of gerrymandering, which permits the elected officials to choose their voters rather than the reverse, right? So I mean, it was literally true. I don't know if it's still true, but when I lived in Austin, Texas was the largest city in the country not to have a congressional representative, right? So they divided Austin up into districts. So there was literally a manhole cover that you could stand in one intersection and be in 3 districts at once. So my representative, when I left, actually lived closer to Houston than to Austin, right? And there's another district that starts in Austin and goes all the way down to the border. of Texas. You know, I mean, the way in which we valorized districts as an essential electoral category, it is just a creation that we've made. There's no justification. I'm sorry?
I didn't make it. A thing I wanted to say, yeah, I have not acquiesced to the US government form of government. You said something about the altar of environmental justice, and I'm saying the altar is capitalism, is profit. The altar is profit. Yeah. If we got rid of profit, we'd have to fight through being able to establish the socialist justice, which would be another project that wouldn't work automatically. People don't have time for going through things. Cuba does. Cuba had time. Venezuela does. Venezuela, Hugo Chavez was not communist when he started out, and neither were the people, and they graduated because of what it got them to being so supportive of effectively communist. I don't know if they're theorists, but that's been the direction of their government, and the of course opposition of the United States.
Well, what's important is having time to meet.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the sociologist, Cliff, you said you did sociology. I'm blanking on her name now. She teaches at Irvine, but she wrote a great book called "Freedom is an Endless Meeting," and it's a story about the civil rights movement, right? But you know, I mean, if you look at the political activism on the right, you know, it's important. A couple of things are important, right? One is to not think of it as a sudden emergence, right? But you know, to trace it back to Barry Goldwater's defeat, right? The tension between the economic right and the cultural right, the fusion between the two, and now ultimately I think the emergence of the what I'll call the cultural right as the main voice of opposition, growing out of that original Goldwater defeat. Well, that's, you know, I'll bet I could choose 10 students, you know, at random, and 3 of them will have heard of Barry Goldwater, right? But in fact, it was a watershed event in the evolution of the right-wing politics. You know, I'm not sure there's been a moment outside of the civil rights movement, and maybe some parts of the environmental movement, right? And this is why the linkage between the two is so important, where a comprehensive emancipatory political agenda has taken root. And you know, well, who was it that said, you know, without wanting to choose, you know, parties, Democrat, Republican, that's not what I said earlier. Remember, I said Democratic, but I was using small d, right? But I also can say, was it Will Rogers said, I'm not a member of any organized party. I'm a Democrat.
Right.
Right. It often feels that way on the left, right?
You know, back to the you know, the complaints about what is called critical race theory by its opponents now. One of the points that is often made against the teaching about the history of racism in the United States is that it makes white students feel bad, to feel guilty, to feel like they're being blamed for the racism. And of course, I always say that, well, they feel that way only if they somehow or another identify with, whites in the past who have created those institutions. If only people could disidentify, detach from that, and see that what was done by previous generations is not my responsibility. I didn't do it, but as a human being, I do have a responsibility to try to redress the consequences of that racism. But that notion that somehow or another people will feel bad, and in fact often do feel bad, and that's one of the reasons why they want to avoid talking about the role of race in U.S. history.
Well, I was going to say, can I start making a list of all the things that make me feel bad, so I can get people not to talk about them? I mean, I understand that critique, but the I mean, I don't even know what to say about that. I mean, I suppose there might be some people doing that, like trying to make people feel bad, but I don't think that's true, right? In some ways, it has been raised to the level of national discussion, right? Because the question of are we eliminating all our heroes, right? Which is the expression that was used with the statues removals and things like that. And the answer is no. We're just being more discerning about who we're calling a hero, and we're trying to match people we think of as heroic to those things we claim to really value. And if you really value slavery, I suppose you might take the defenders of the slave states as your heroes, but then you got to own that too.
Yeah. If we can return to this question of environmental justice, and you referred to the powerful negative impact that climate change is having in some parts of the world, particularly, the global South and the poorer countries, even though they've had less to do with creating the climate change, but they're the ones who are paying the price disproportionately. And that injustice is paralleled now with the pandemic and the vaccine inequality that exists, with the wealthy countries having hoarded so much of the vaccine and it not being made available in many other parts of the world. I mean, for example, with this new Omicron virus that first emerged in South Africa, the president of South Africa the other day complained, well, look, you cut off air travel from South Africa now, but really what you ought to be doing is making sure that we get the vaccines so that we can combat the virus. But this, it's an interesting parallel that between the environmental injustice and also the virus injustice that we're seeing.
Oh no! I mean, we see it domestically. We see it internationally. But let me just give you one other example. if you, the studies vary, but the number of climate migrants, right? People who are going to be required to leave their territory because it's no longer habitable. We're already seeing that in the American South, southern border, right? A lot of the migrants from Central America are in fact climate migrants because of the decline in rainfall in their basically farming areas. But you also see places where, you know, the island nations where you have land disappearing. One of the difficulties, of course, is there's no legal category for climate migrants, right? So that it's not a category that we recognize creates any legitimacy for the person who's being forced to migrate because of climate change. Well, I mean, I think we have to confront that, for example. The case I was referring to earlier are the cases of dealing with indigenous communities as communities in order to adequately address the justice issues related to climate change impact on them. Right? There are a number of things that we're going to have to think about differently. That the COVID pandemic has started to reveal, but you know, hasn't really had an impact on changing our thinking about it. I mean, you know, you mentioned the new Omicron variant, you know, being referred to as a, you know, African variant. Well, you know, it's also shown up in 5 different other parts of the world. The problem, right, or the thing you can think about is, look, here you had a country that was outward facing enough for it to, upon its identification of the variant, to notify the rest of the world about its presence, and then precipitate action, right? And for that, there's a kind of stigma attached. You know, that's part of the injustice too, right? So, I mean, you know, think about the legal categories that are going to create additional problems for us, that are going to enable some people to say, look, you know, they're not climate migrants. They're just, you know, ordinary people who are trying to leave their country and enter our country illegally, right? Or they're, you know, let's deport them, right? And for some of these people, you're going to, you know, deport them to land that doesn't exist anymore, right? To conditions where they can't make a living. And so the question is, what do you do, or how do you conceive of what the appropriate response ought to be, consistent with the things we claim to value? And that's what's critical to me.
Okay.
Somebody had their hand up over there, but it
Yes.
used to be the Center for Global Justice.
Yep. Bob Stone has come into the Zoom room, and you have a question, Bob?
I just wanted to pick up on the point that Jerry's just making, and the policy advocated by the WHO, which is, I gather, for the wealthy countries to, before they arrogate to themselves the third booster, to share with the rest of the world their patents and resources, since the argument goes, if we don't all make ourselves defend ourselves against this virus, we will all die sooner or later. And now with this new variant, Omicron, that's not an unlikely or impossible alternative. I'd like to ask you to ponder and to think of, Jerry, the idea of that's being proposed here, which is that we consider humanity itself as the pertinent group. And I think they've mentioned something like 40% of humans should be first vaccinated. And then we could entertain the idea that wealthy nations could have their booster shots. That's a very familiar principle. You delineate the boundaries of a given group and say of that group that it will observe rules and procedures pertinent to its defense as such, as a group. This seems to me to be a rather new and interesting idea, legally speaking, that humanity is could be considered the sum and total of us alive now on the face of this planet could be considered such a group. And we got to look after ourselves. And the proposal is that 40% of us first get vaccinated, and then we'll look at the idea of having the wealthier nations have their. What I'm saying, this is extremely utopian from a neoliberal political viewpoint, from the viewpoint of the supremacy of markets, and Pfizer and all of those people are fighting against any such thinking of considering humanity as a whole to be the recipient and the guardian, the producer of its protection and the enforcer of it. What do you think of that turn of mind and this how would you advance that thought to humanity as its own protector?
Well, two things. One is, certainly in the context of the pandemic, it seems to me clear beyond peradventure that the obligation ought to be to make the vaccine as widely available as possible. For the sole purpose that you identified, which is we increase the level of safety for everyone as a whole to the extent that we permit people to, or permit the vaccines to be made available, and that even if we had to make vaccines available, even if there were financial liability, sorting that out at the back end is better than trying to sort it out at the front end before we, if it means people aren't going to be vaccinated. That, the species survival is an issue that has to be taken seriously, not in a piecemeal way, the way we, the conventional way we've typically done it, but to ask which policies might we enact as a people that are most beneficial to humanity. And so it's, it's not pie in the sky, it's not utopian, it's in some ways it's a basic calculus that you can set a benchmark from and then judge to what extent or greater or lesser extent you actually achieve that. I mean, it seems to me not to be utopian in the least, but rather one that gives you a framework.
Necessary. Well, who would do it? The UN?
Well, I don't know. I think I think we can all begin to do it rather than rely on institutions. Let me give you an example. One of the things that we're doing at the Center for Environmental Justice is mapping various environmental burdens and how we might respond to them. In talking to the community members, this is why I think talking to people matters, right? They said, well, look, instead of just drawing a map of where the hazards currently exist, why don't you draw a map of what we want the city to look like, right? And then that can become the map of where we want to go. And then we can start to ask, what do we have to do to make this map a reality? Well, I mean, to take your point, there's no reason, why we couldn't all begin that. Ultimately, we want to work through institutions, but we shouldn't depend on the institutions to develop those goals. The goals are ours. And what we need to do is articulate them through whatever fora we can. I'm working on a book now, which takes its title from an article that my colleague and I wrote called Changing the Wind. Changing the Wind.
Thank you.
And the idea is, it starts from, there was a fellow, a preacher who said, look, you can always tell who the politician is. He's the guy who licks his finger and sticks it up and tells you which way the wind is blowing. He says, well, you can't change policy or change the future by changing wet-fingered politicians. You can only do it by changing the wind, changing the direction the wind blows. And that's, I think, what we need to focus on. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's an interesting image. We're going to have to let Gerald go because he has
A 3:30 appointment.
Yes, appointment there at Yale coming up in a few minutes. But I do want to thank you for a very provocative 90-minute discussion. And I hope that others enjoyed it as much as I did. Today's webinar, by the way, is available on YouTube as our previous webinars. You can view them at our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Next Monday, we are going to be discussing a new film that has come out, The Big Scary S Word. What's more American than socialism? This film will be available to be viewed ahead of time. We will not be screening it during our webinar. Rather, we will use that time to talk with the filmmaker, Yale Bridge. But if you look in the chat box, there's information as to how you can access the film for viewing. And we will leave the chat box open for a while so that you can copy down that information, or go to our website for the description of this webinar, and you'll find that information there.
What do you mean by chat box? I'm looking at chat and it's empty.
Well, it shouldn't be empty. I put
Oh.
that information there. And
Okay, well, I missed it.
I see it, but
Thank you.
if I take the screen share down, maybe you can see it now in chat. In any case, it is available on our website as well. Well, in closing, I want to thank our webinar team, Roberto Robles, Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamant, Olivia Canales, Bob Stone, and myself. And now this is Cliff Durand signing off until next Monday.
Thank
Take
you
care.
very
Thank
much.
you all.
Wonderful show. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Gerald. Okay, everyone else has left, so I guess I can take it down now.